Alright, welcome back everybody. My name is Dustin. And in the last video, we added the tile details display for the tile map editor here. This handles the tile width, the height, layer. We also added the ability to hide the layer if we check this little button. Eventually it's going to be an eye, and then later on we're going to have a trash can or delete button so we can delete all the tiles on the layer. So in this video we're going to start the scene hierarchy. The scene hierarchy will allow us to see all of the game objects that are currently in this scene and delete them, add components, and all that fun stuff. The game objects will be separate from the tiles. So these aren't game objects in our engine. Our engine, these are tiles. They are separate entities or separate things. However, they're basically the same thing. They're just entities with various components, right? The only difference is how we're going to deal with them. Our scene hierarchy is going to be in this window. So we're going to get rid of this IMGUI demo. We're not going to get rid of the code, obviously. This is a very valuable resource for the IMGUI demo. However, we are going to use this slot here, or this docking panel, for our scene hierarchy. All right, let's start creating the scene hierarchy display. Okay, so just like all the other displays, we're going to put it in our displays folder here. So go add, new file. And it's going to be the scene hierarchy display.h. Add it. This is going to have our pragma once. And we want to include iDisplay. So let's actually create the new display and put it right into the application so we can see it right away. Okay, so we'll go namespace, Scion Editor, and we'll say class scene hierarchy display. That's going to be inherit from display, or iDisplay. iDisplay, control KD. And we're going to have, let's just start with the public stuff that we're going to have. And we're just going to have our scene hierarchy constructor and destructor. Probably don't need these really, but we're going to put them in anyway. And then we're going to have our overrides that we need to do. So virtual void update and virtual void draw. Let's add override to these. Cool. All right, that's good to start. So let's create all of this. But before we do that, let's quickly go and create the CPP file. So add new file. And this is going to be scene hierarchy display.cpp. Yep, we'll add it. Include scene hierarchy display. Namespace Scion Editor. Go back to the header file and let's create these. Oh, it didn't create them all. So control KO. We should be able to create all of these. Yeah, right here. Create. Cool. So what we're going to just do is work on the draw. We don't have to do anything in the update right now either. Let's just do this real fast. We'll get to that. First thing I'm going to want to do is actually check to see if there's a new scene. So we're going to need to add some includes up here. And we'll include the scene manager. So editor, scene manager, scene object. Might as well include the main registry. That's core ECS main registry. And we're going to need the entity, so we might as well include that as well. Entity.h, and that's good for now. Actually, we're going to need the components as well, so let's add that. Components, all components, cool. All right, the reason why we need the entity and the components is because the scene hierarchy is going to control adding components to a selected entity, but we'll get to that. First, let's get this actually drawing. First thing, again, we're going to want to get the scene, so auto p current scene is equal to scene manager get current scene. And if we don't have a valid current scene at the moment, we're just going to want to leave So if not current scene, actually, let's keep that and do the I am GUI as well. So go, if not, I am GUI begin, or not current scene. Oh, or to use I am GUI, we're going to need to include I am GUI. Include I am GUI. .h. Let's go down here. So if not, I am GUI begin, and this is going to be our scene hierarchy. Or we don't have the current scene. We're going to want to end I am GUI end, and then just return. And then from here, let's take this end again and put it down here, just in case that we do have the scene. We want to make sure that we're still calling our end function. Cool. All right, and that should be good for now. Let's go to our application.cpp and add that in. So application.cpp, where are all our displays? Here's our displays, so we'll just copy that one down and say scene hierarchy display. We'll follow this to here. We need to add it in. So this is in our application create displays function, and we can just copy this whole line here. Scene hierarchy. Could be a Y. There's that, and then we just got to add it here, and we can just copy this down. Cool. So we have our scene hierarchy display, and now we want to go to our render I am GUI right here. And we have our Dear I'm GUI demo. We're going to want to change that now to use our scene hierarchy. Scene hierarchy. Cool. And where are we doing our I am GUI demo? Right here, and I am GUI show demo. We're just going to comment it out just in case we want to bring it back up, but we don't need it anymore. And let's build, and it should show our scene hierarchy now where the I am GUI demo window was. Awesome, and that worked. So that's exactly what we want. And now we're going to want to be able to list all of our entities, all of our game objects actually, and be able to select them and add components and stuff like that. So let's start working on that. So in order to do that, we're going to have to add a few things here. So let's add a private section. In our private section, we're going to need two things. We're going to need a shared pointer to the entity. So we're going to say std shared pointer. That's going to be Scion core entity MP selected entity. And this can just start out as null pointer. And we're going to want to forward declare this. So we can say namespace Scion core. That should actually be ECS. ECS. And then class entity. Grab this. We need this here. Cool. And we're also going to need a flag or bool for adding a component. MB add component. And this will start as false. And I'll show you where we're going to use that shortly. So also, we're going to have a private here. This is for the function, so some private functions. And the first private function I'm going to have is if we go back and take a look at the scene hierarchy, you're going to want to have a list of entities or game objects, right? So let's just quickly add in a scene to our tile map so we can see this. See how we have tree nodes here? That's what we're going to want. So we're going to want to open a tree node for each entity. And eventually, we're going to have a relationship between the entities. So you can have parents and you'll be able to child the entities up amongst each other. But we're not going to do that today. We're going to get into that later on. So we can create a function and we'll just call this bool open tree node. Bool open tree node. And it's going to take in our entity. And it's going to be Scion core ECS entity. And it's going to be a reference, and it's going to be the entity. Cool. And we're also going to have another private function for adding the component, okay? So void add component. That's also going to take in the entity, so we can copy this. Paste that in. And it's going to take in the pointer to that add component boolean. So bool pointer b add component. You can call it BP if you like, or PB. We're also going to have two draw calls. One is going to be for drawing the game object details. Void draw game object details. And what this is actually going to be its own window. And then we're going to have void draw entity components. So this is going to be the components of the selected entity being drawn in the game object details panel. Now, the reason why we want this, we want it to be controlled by the scene hierarchy, okay? So let's create these 4 functions. So before we actually do the open tree node, let's go to where we're going to use it, and that's going to be in our draw function. So we're going to want to loop through all of the game objects in the scene. First thing we want to do is grab the actual registry. So let's go auto reference reg is equal to, we can say registry, is equal to p current scene get registry. And now we want to get a view of the scene entities. But we want to make sure that we exclude entities with tile components, and we might as well exclude entities that have a script component because we don't actually want to see that as an entity to choose. Okay, so we can go auto scene entities, or you can say game objects, or, and we'll just say registry dot get registry dot view entity, or ENTT entity. So we want to get all entities, and then we want to ENTT exclude tile component and script component. Now we have an error right here because we need to use our namespace up here. So up here, so if we go using namespace Scion core ECS. Cool, go back down. So what this is going to do is give us all the entities except the ones that have tile component and script component. And then here we can go for auto entity in scene entities. We're going to want to create an entity ent, and that's going to take in the registry and the entity. Now that we have the entity, we can go if open tree node, send in the entity, and then go I am GUI tree pop. Cool. All right. So let's actually do this function now. For now, all we want to do is draw the entity's name as a tree node. Later on, we'll add the ability to set the entity as a selected entity that we can make changes to. So the first thing I want to do is go const auto reference, and we'll just say name is equal to entity get name. Now that we have the name, we're going to want to push the ID of the entity so that it's somewhat unique. For that, we'll use the entity itself, for it is only a number after all. And we'll go I am GUI push ID. And we'll say static cast int 32 t, and we'll say entity dot get entity. Now the entity is actually underneath the entity is a uint32, but I haven't had a problem doing it this way. Now, if we have a problem doing that, we may have to adjust, but this is working for me now. I've never had that many entities where it would use that, all of int32. So now we can set the tree node flags that we want to use. We can set this as a const expr value in our utilities, but we'll just put this in here for now. So I can say I am GUI tree node flags, node flags is equal to I am GUI tree node flags default open, because we want it to by default be open. Then we want to say I am GUI tree node flags frame padding. I am GUI tree node flags open on arrow. I am GUI tree node flags span the available width. All right. Now you can change your flags to whatever you want them to be, but that's what I want. And we're going to say bool is b tree node open, and that will default to false. And then I can say b tree node open is equal to I am GUI tree node extended name dot c string and send in our node flags. Cool. And then we're going to want to pop our ID. Pop ID. And then return our B tree node open. We're going to be adding more into this function shortly, but this is good for now to get us going. So let's actually add a quick function in so we can create an entity. And this is just going to be a lambda. We'll just put it up here right now. So we'll just say auto add entity. Or actually, we'll say create entity. Okay. And that's equal to, and it's just going to capture whatever's passed in. And then we'll say Scion Editor. And I'm going to want to send in the scene object as a reference, because when we create the entity, we want to create it for the specific scene that's passed in. Okay, we can just say current scene. Cool. Now, eventually, we're going to want to move this to the scene, because when we start actually doing the parents and having relationships and all this stuff, and we want to make sure that the scene doesn't have an entity with that tag already. If it has that tag or name, we're going to want to say _1 or whatever, so we don't have the same name. Just easier to organize our entities, but we'll get into that later. It's not that important right now, so that's why we're just going to put it here and say new entity, and that's just going to be current scene and get registry, and it's going to be game object. That's all we need for this. And right away, I'll add in the transform component. So new entity dot add component transform component, and that's just going to be an empty transform component. And that's just going to be default. Cool. So let's go back to our draw function and check that out right here. We might as well put it in right here, and we can say if I am GUI begin pop-up context window. Then we're going to want to end our pop-up and pop-up. And we're going to create a selectable here. So if I am GUI selectable, and we're just going to say add new game object. And if that's selected, we're going to say create entity and send in the current scene. Cool. All right, let's test that out. See if we can add our entities in and see if our nodes are being drawn. Cool. So we can't do anything right now because we don't have a scene. So we need to add our scene. tile map editor, add our scene. Cool. Go here and add new game object. Boom, we got our game object. Look at that. Can't select it yet. We'll handle that now. Add. It's adding new game objects in. That's exactly what we wanted to see. Cool. And if we switch scenes, those should go and add 2 in here, and the other one had 3. If we go back, it has 3. Perfect. Cool. Now that we know that's working, let's actually make sure that we can select it. Let's go here and select our entity. Let's do that right about here. So we can say if I am GUI, is item clicked. Now we want to get the scene and pass it into the entity. So we want to say MP selected entity is equal to std make shared entity. And we can say scene manager dot get registry, or get current scene get registry, get current scene get registry. And then we want to send in the entity. So entity dot get entity. Now, this is not creating a new entity. We're creating a shared pointer that can look at this particular entity, right? So we're not actually adding a new one in. We're just getting its data right here. That one. Cool. Let's go back in. And now that we have our selected entity, we can actually set if it's our current node. And we'll do that right here. So we can say if the selected entity is the current node, highlight the selected node. So we can say if MP selected entity, so if it's not null pointer, and MP selected entity get entity is equal to entity.getEntity. Then I want to say node flags or equals I am GUI tree node flags selected. That's why we put this up here, because we want to put our node flags into our tree node extended. Cool. Let's make sure that works. Awesome. Let's go to our scenes, tile map editor, drag that in, add a new entity. Let's add a few. Perfect. It's selected. And you see how the selected is changing? That's exactly what we wanted to see. So we're actually selecting our entity now. Perfect. Cool. Let's go back. So now let's do the draw game details. Before we do add component, that one's a bit more juicy. So let's go draw game details. The draw game object details is actually going to be its own display. This display will be populated with the details of the selected game object or entity. It'll also handle adding components in. So let's start this right now. So the first thing I'm going to say, if not, I am GUI begin. And we'll say object details. And then we're going to do what we always do. I am GUI end return, copy I am GUI end, and put it right here. Cool. So this one's pretty straightforward. It's actually just going to call the draw entity components function. It's only going to do that if it has a valid entity. Okay. So let's say if MP selected entity, then draw entity components. Cool. But before we do that, let's actually create a pop-up context window so we can add in the new component to the selected entity. So if I go if I am GUI begin pop-up context window, and I'm going to say if I am GUI selectable add component, and here I'm going to say MB add component is equal to true. Now, why are we doing this? Because this is going to be its own pop-up modal. Okay, and we'll do that here. So if MB add component. Then we're going to say add component. That's going to take in the entity. So we got to make sure this as well. If selected entity and add component, or and add component, then we send in the entity MP selected entity and the address of MB add component. Cool. That's it. That's all we need for this for now. Now you could have more options that you want to add in, like maybe not just add component. You might want to do something else to that particular entity, and you can just add those in here. And I forgot to do the I am GUI and pop up. Cool. So now we also have to make sure that we add in our object details to our doc builder. So let's go back here, and in our doc builder, we're going to want to add our object details, and I'm going to want it in the right node again. So this actually will show you which ones go on top. So let's just copy this one down. I don't mind. Actually, let's have this one first. So object details. We'll cut this. Put that here. Cool. Now that one should pop up first as soon as we have a selected ID or selected entity. Let's run it just to make sure that it pops up. All right, go to our scene, tile map, default scene, doesn't matter which scene. Add, selected. Okay, so it didn't pop up. I must have forgot to call this function. I probably did. So let's go back to scene hierarchy. And I believe we have to put this in the draw function. Yeah, we didn't put it in there. So right after IamGUI end, because this is its own window and it's not a child, I actually want to do this right after. Draw game object details. Cool. Run it again. Scene. So it automatically draws that. Now I'm not sure if we want to not draw that unless there's something selected, but now it's selected, and the goal is to display the components of the selected entity over here. Okay, so if we go back to this function, so we have two things. We have our add component and our draw entity components. Let's do the draw entity components first, then we'll do the add components one. Okay, I know we have this check here, so we won't even call this function, but I'm going to check this again. And if so, and say if not, and we're just going to return just in case. For this, we're actually going to want to grab the registry associated with the selected entity. So we can go auto reference registry is equal to MP selected entity get registry. And we're going to want to add in the using namespace ENTT literals. Actually, let's put this right at the top, because we're going to actually need to use the ENTT meta. Where was that? Right here. So now we want to loop through all of the storages and check to see if the storage contains that particular entity. In this case, we're basically checking for the components of the entity. Okay, so let's go for const auto. And that's going to be ID and storage. Cool. And it's going to be the registry dot storage. Cool. So the ID here is going to be the ENTT ID type, which for us is the type hash value. Okay, so we're looping through all the storages that this registry has. And I want to check to see if it contains this entity or not. So if I go if not storage dot contains, so for this particular storage, does it contain our entity? So MP selected entity get entity. If it doesn't, we're just going to want to continue because there's no need to look into that storage. Okay. Now we also want to make sure that the ID is not the tile component. If it is, we're going to want to continue. It's probably an unnecessary check, but it shows you how we can check ID. So if ID is equal to ENTT type hash tile component value. And we're also going to want to continue here. Continue. Awesome. So now we can actually draw our component. For that, we're going to want to invoke a meta function. So we can draw the component based on the ID type that is passed in. If you remember from before, we created the draw entity component info. We also added it to ENTT meta. So let's go take a look at that right here. So if we go to utilities, and we have this here. We created this register UI function. Okay. So if I go to the .inl file, we created this. Now this is where we want to use this. So if we go to our back here, we want to go and make sure we add in our meta helpers. So right here. So include core ECS meta utilities. And where was that function? And right here, I'm going to want to say const auto draw info. And that's going to be equal to Scion core utils invoke meta function. And that's going to take in the ID. And we're going to say draw entity component info. HS. And that takes in the entity. I believe that's all it takes in. Let's take a look just to make sure. Here, draw entity component info. Yes, that's just taking in our entity here. And so that is just a dereference np selected entity. Cool. All right, so before we can actually use this function, we're going to need to register all the components that we will want to draw for that entity or that the entity could have. So to handle that, we're actually just going to add them to the application.cpp in the initialization function. So application.cpp, let's go to the top and let's add in our draw utils unless it's already here. I don't see it. So let's include editor utilities. Okay, and let's go to the bottom of our initialization function here. Sure. Right here is good. We're going to be removing this stuff shortly anyway, so we might as well put it in. So we can go draw component util register UI component, and that's going to be identification. So we didn't put a namespace in, so using Scion core ECS identification. Copy this down. Transform sprite component, animation component, physics component, text component, rigid body component, box collider, and circle collider. I think that's good for now. I don't think I'm missing any that we are using currently. And that should work for us. So let's go back to our scene hierarchy. All right. That should handle drawing it for us. If it doesn't, we'll go and fix whatever issues we have. So right here, if we're drawing the info, we may want to actually remove that particular component. So let's go if draw info. So if it's valid, I want to say I am GUI spacing. Then say I am GUI push ID. And that's just going to be this ID that we pass in. Then I'm going to say if I am GUI button, and it's going to be remove. Now, eventually, instead of having the remove there, we're going to put a trash can. So we'd use an image button, but this is what we're going to use for now. And in order to remove it, we want to say storage dot remove the entity. Cool. And then pop the ID. I am GUI pop ID. Oh, I don't need to put that in. KD. And then at the end, we can say I am GUI spacing and add a separator in. All right. So that's the draw function. It's pretty straightforward. So all we're doing is drawing any components that the entity already has. And right now, when we create an entity, it's only starting with a transform component. Let's actually add the sprite component as well. So just a default sprite component if we can. Now, they won't always have that, so we'll remove that after this test and just start. All of them should have a transform component, though. All entities or game objects should start with a transform. So let's try this out and make sure that the draw game object is working. Draw entity components, sorry. Okay, so let's load our scene. We have our scene here. Add a game object. Bang! All right, so it's drawing all these components for us. Now this needs to be fixed. It's a bit ugly. Sprite sheet position. So we need to fix that, and we can change the textures. Do we have any textures loaded? We must not. So let's go here, run this, and let's just make sure that this works. So we have our textures, and we got a lot of textures here. So let's just add the player. And width 16 by 16, sure. See, it's drawing that there. It's pretty small. So let's make this 32 by 32. Awesome. So it draws the player here. And we can move its position. Let's say 250. 250. Cool. So it's drawing that in there. Let's add a new game object. And bloop. See how that changed? Because it's doing something else. We'll add a new game object there. And we'll just create a... let's just do the shot. So I should have created at 0, 0. It did right there. And we can just move this around right here and change this to 32 by 32. Awesome. Looks like this is working as well. Awesome. So let's say 256. Sure. Cool. So we have two separate ones and it's working. That's exactly what we want. We can change the name of this here. So instead of game object, this one can be player. And you see how it changed over here? That's exactly what we want. All right, now we want to be able to add a component. See, it's not doing anything, so when we right click, we can add component. We want to be able to add a component, okay? So let's close this. And let's remove our sprite up here. We don't need that. Cool. And we want to do the add component function right here. Okay, so for the add component function, we're going to want to add a new pop-up modal. So we say if b add component, I am GUI, open pop-up, and it's just going to say add component. Cool. Let's actually check to see if this is valid as well. B add component, and just in case. And then now we want to do the begin pop-up modal. So if I am GUI begin pop-up modal, and it's going to be the add component. Might as well put the end in. I am GUI and pop-up. Cool. So now that we have the pop-up open, we're going to want to loop through all of the available component types from ENTT meta and add them to a map so we can list them later in a combo box. So let's go auto registry is equal to entity.get registry. So then we're going to want to get all the reflected types from ENTT meta. So get all of the reflected types from ENTT meta. And we can say std map ENTT ID type std string, and we'll just call this our component map. And to get all the types, we can use ENTT resolve. Resolve returns a range that has all of the meta types. So we can go for auto ID and type ENTT resolve. Make this a bit bigger. All right, from here, we can actually get the type info so we can grab its name and use it in the component box later. So we can go const auto reference info is equal to type dot info. Let's actually take a look at what this does first. And then we'll just put int x. I just want to stop here really fast and show you what we need to do. And we'll put a breakpoint here. And let's run this in. Okay. Okay, so all I want to do is take a little look at the data here that we get back from the info. So add, select, add component, bang. Cool. So we have our info here. Okay. And it gives us this alias, which is its name. So if we look at this here, so now I don't want any of all this stuff. I only want identification. So what I need to do is find the last colon and get all of that afterwards. So let's do that right now. Stop this, get rid of this, and we can say auto pause because we need to get the position is equal to info dot name dot find last of, and this is just a colon +1. Then we want to go auto name is equal to info dot name dot substring of pause. So this will give us everything after this position, starting and after this position. So I want to go components, component map, at the ID is equal to std string of the name. Cool. All right. So what this is going to do is fill up our map with all of the components that are available to us. So now I'm going to make a few static variables here. Could add these as member variables, but static is fine because it's only going to be used here. Static std string. I'm going to say component string default empty, and prev, we're going to want a previous component, and we're going to need a static entt id type. That could just be 0. Needs to say id type. There we go. Then static bool be error. So do we have an error? And that can be false for now. So false. If we already have the component, we don't want to add it again. So we're going to have this error here to tell the user or display something to the user that that component already exists. So now we want to create the combo box and list all of the components. So we can go if I am GUI begin combo, and that's going to be choose component. And that's going to take in the component string as a C string. Okay, so all we're going to do here now is loop through the map that we created above. Okay, so we can go for const auto reference ID and name of the component map. Okay, and then we can do if I am GUI selectable name.cstring, name is equal to components string. And if that's the case, we're going to want to set the component string is equal to name, and the ID type is equal to ID. Cool. Then we can end our combo. All right. So right here, I want to check to see if the component string is not equal to the previous one. And then I want to set the previous to the component string and then reset our error. So if component string is not equal to component string prev, then I want to say component string prev is equal to component string, and then b error is equal to false. Cool. So now we want to check to see if we have an error. So if we have an error, so if b error, we're going to want to display an error. I am GUI, text colored, I am vec4, and it's going to be a red error, 255, 0, 0, 255, or floats, so let's say 1.f, 0.f, 0.f, 1.f. Cool. And then we can say fmt format, and then we can say entity game object already has, please make another selection. And then there we can pass in the component string. And we can say C-string. That should work for us. Now we want to have an OK button to actually add the component. So if we go if I am GUI button, and it's just going to be OK. Or you can say add or anything like that. And we want to see if not component string dot empty. So if it's not empty, now we want to add the component to the entity. And for that, we need to loop through the storages. So go for auto ID storage registry storage. First thing that we want to do is check to see if the ID is the same as the ID type that was selected above, or the component ID. So if ID is not equal to ID type, and we can just continue here because we're not interested in that particular storage. So now I want to check to see if the storage contains that entity. If it already contains that entity, we want to throw an error here. Okay, so we can say if storage dot contains, and we say entity dot get entity. I want to say b error is equal to true. I want to log the error. And then I want to break, because we're already trying to add in something that the entity already has. Now, all this is a check. We're checking to see if the entity is in that storage, and we're getting the error, okay? So basically, this is just an error check. So we can go break, so we can just have a little comment. The entity does not have that component yet. Proceed. We're still in the OK, and we want to go in here and check to see if there's an error. So if b error, add component is going to be false. And I am GUI, close current pop-up. Now it's saying that we're dereferencing a null pointer, but we already checked it up here. Actually, we can do this. So if b add component, if not, we can just return. Remove this from here. Cool. That should handle this because it should already know that it's returning. So if we don't have an error, we can say else. And now we're going to want to add the component to the entity. So the first thing we need to do is grab the storage. So auto reference storage is equal to registry dot storage at that ID type. Okay. If there's no storage return, so what this is actually returning a sparse set pointer. If there's no storage return, that means that there are no entities that have that particular ID. So what we're going to want to do here is add the component to the entity rather than push it into the storage. Okay. So let's say if not storage, but we'll do that after because there's a little bit more to this, but we'll do the else condition. Okay, which is a lot easier. If the storage already exists, all we want to do is push that entity into the storage. So we can say storage push entity.get entity. Okay, then we can say b add component is equal to false. I am GUI close current popup. Cool. And right in the same line, right here, let's add a cancel button. So I am GUI, same line, or if I am GUI button cancel b error equals false, b add component is equal to false. I am GUI close current popup. Now we could reset everything else here as well. Like all of these statics, we could reset them in any of these. We could create a simple lambda and just create. We're basically doing the same thing each time. So we have our cancel handled. We have the storage exists handled. The last thing we need to do now is actually if there is no storage. So no entities have been created that have that component. Because if we're trying to grab the storage of an ID type that doesn't have any storages, then we're going to have an error if we try to dereference this down here. Okay, we're going to crash. We don't want to do that. So what we want to do here, if there's no storage for that ID type, we're going to need a new meta function. So let's go to our entity.h in our core, include core ECS entity.h and .inl. Okay. All right. So down here, we already have the add component. Now I want to add another one. It's going to be add default component. Okay. So here, copy this. Because this one takes in a soul state, takes in all the soul stuff, we don't want that. We want to get rid of all of this. Here, add component. And I'm just going to say default just to differentiate. Okay. And I want to create it in the entity.inl. Cool. And this one's just going to be entity dot. We can return here. So return entity dot add component t component and then just t component. That should work. Then we need to add this to our register meta component here. So we can just copy this line down, add component default. Copy this, copy this. Cool. So this should automatically be registering all of our components because we're already calling most of these or all the components for the register meta component. So let's go back into our scene hierarchy display. And now let's call our add component function. So we can say const auto add component is equal to Scion core utils invoke meta function of this ID type. That's going to be our component. And then it's add component default underscore HS and then pass in the entity. Cool. Now we still need to verify that the add component is successful. So if add component, I want to be add component is equal to false. Then I am GUI close current popup. Cool. I think that's all we need there. I guess B error could be, well, we shouldn't have an error if it got to here. Else we're going to go else. Now I'm just going to assert this for now. Scion assert, and it's going to be false. False. Or we could probably set, I'm wondering if we can, yeah, we can probably just assert that. Assert add component Failed to add component. So this will be false. B add component is equal to false. Then we want to actually set our error. B error is equal to true. And then I am GUI, close current pop-up. Cool. All right, I think that handles all of our cases. If we have any issues, we will make adjustments. All right. So let's see if that works. And run. Okay. So that built, let's add our scene. Right here. Cool. Get an entity here. So we have our transform, our identification. Let's add a sprite, and we got an error. Cool, that's fine. So invalid string view position. Right here. Oh, first of, stop that. Let's try again. You guys probably caught that already. Sometimes autocomplete completely wrecks what I'm trying to do. Try again. Oh, again. What else did I do? Oh, I'm an idiot. That's another thing you guys probably caught. All right, try again. Okay. Scenes. Tile map. Add object. Add component. Bam! There we go. All right. So we can choose the component that we want to add, and it drops down, and we have all the components. What's all there? Beautiful. Okay. So let's see. Let's just add something we already have so we can see if there's an error. Add. Okay. Now add. Yeah. So I don't want to close this after. I want the error to pop up right away rather than what it's doing here. But that's good. At least we know that it does give us the error. So instead of closing it, I wanted to cancel it out. So that's going to be a challenge for you guys. I'll make sure it's fixed in the next video. So let's go here, sprite component, add sprite component. Bam! It added the sprite component. It's exactly what we wanted to do. Start the scene so we can get some textures. Right here, let's get a texture. And I think we can actually go to our textures. I wonder if I set that up to drag it in. Let's drag it in. No, the drag doesn't work. We have to figure out why. So let's go to player, and this is 32 by 32. Awesome. It's working exactly how I want. So if we go here, add component, let's add a box collider. Cool. It's got the box collider, 16 by 16. Let's see, did I add that in? No, I did not. So we can't see the, oh, right here, show collision. Awesome, there's our collision. It looks like that's working too. So if we go in close, we can change the width of it, 32, 32, or we can keep it 16 by 16 and move its offset, 16, too much, 8, 8. So there's another bug here. That shouldn't be red. So these are little fixes that you guys can go over, or I can go over later, but little challenges for you guys. So looks like that's working exactly how we want it. So here we go to the next game object. We can add a component. What component that we want? We want a sprite component. Adds our sprite. Perfect. That's it for the videos, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed what you saw. In the next videos to come, we're either going to work on relationships here so we can actually have the entity can have children. So we're going to work on that as well. And we're going to start getting into events because we're going to want to start changing some of the ways that we're doing stuff to use events rather than the way that we're doing it. Please like and subscribe. And that's it. Take it easy.